You know what, the reason why I was looking for these Asian models, and South Korea was one model, but what's interesting is both Indonesia and the Philippines had extractive, we had dictators. In Indonesia for 32 years you had Suharto, in the Philippines for 21 years we had Marcos. And when you talk about extractive leaders, extractive systems at that point, analysts in the region say that the reason why Indonesia did better was because their Suharto funneled the money back into Indonesia while the Marcoses took the money out. This is one of the things. How do you get from, go ahead.
Yeah, but so like this business of sort of developmental dictatorship, this is
something else.
This is an experience. This
like
is a
Singapore.
Yeah,
right?
but this is a phenomenon which is completely restricted, to parts of Asia. There's never been a developmental dictator in Africa. There's never been a developmental dictator in Latin America. And why is it so difficult to have a developmental dictator in the Philippines? Because the Philippines is much more historically, like a Latin American country than it is
Actually,
Singapore or South
with
Korea
a constitution
or
like the
Japan.
United States.
But going back to Spanish colonization, and so this is much more like, or not just Spanish colonization, but even historical construction of states and society going back before the Spanish. If you think about the roots of South Korean, bureaucratic competence or whatever, that's something deeply rooted in this Chinese model of bureaucracy, the examination system. This is much earlier. This goes back much deeper than colonization or whatever it is. And if you think about the nature of pre-colonial society in the Philippines, it looks nothing like Japan or Korea or China.
Right.
So I would, so that's why you got stuck with Marcos and not, I would say not President Park, and but that being said, there's also Laos in Asia and Nepal, and there's Burma,
Still coming in.
Burma has very similar problems, in the sense of a very different pattern of state formation, very diverse population, never under the control of central state, and peripheral areas wanting to be independent, insurgencies. I would have thought Burma has a lot of the same types of problems going forward, than the Philippines has, But lots of other countries in the world are like that, and you just have to solve the problems and try to build. The basic message is still you have to try to build an inclusive society to be economically successful. But history gives you different problems to deal with.
So, in your view, given what you know, the snapshot of the Philippines that you see now, and what steps can it take to get closer to a more inclusive?
Well, I think that after the people's power in the 1980s, there was a lot of progress made, towards a different type of political system. But, getting rid of the personalistic dictatorship is a good thing, but that many elements of extractive political and economic institutions persist in society. So I think the lesson, that I would draw for not being an expert, not pretending to be an expert on the Philippines.
We'd love your insights into other things.
Is that what you have to keep on trying to build the inclusive institutions. You have to try to build this road that was started on after 1986, but in some sense got derailed. Why did it get derailed? Because in the coalition which opposed the Marcos dictatorship, some groups were much more organized than others. And once Marcos was on the plane out of the country, then the people that are organized tend to take over. And that's many old elites, traditional elites, bosses, people with a vested interest in monopolies, in a very non-inclusive economy. And to keep their non-inclusive economy, they need to keep the political system non-inclusive as well, because if the political system became more inclusive, you wouldn't be able to have your monopolies. You wouldn't be able to have all these ways of extracting rents from societies, and so those veto players, you call them in political science, they're all they're still there. They're more or less powerful, and one has to try to build a coalition of in society to recognize. I read President Aquino's social contract that he had when he came to power. It seems to me he has a very clear vision that that one needs to develop an inclusive political set of political coalition. You have to build this coalition, this what we call in the book a broad coalition.
Right.
So how do you build that coalition? I don't know. You'd need to know a lot about different interests and different political players and in Philippine society. Who's involved in that coalition? Is that civil society? Is it different types of civil society groups? That's something in which the media, social media, other types of media can play a huge role in trying to make the political system more accountable, in trying to show people, what's at stake, from the present system and how things could be organized differently.
I think what you're going to see is that it's been nearly 30 years since people power, and the same structures have remained. The faces have changed. And we still have a basically feudalistic structure where patronage, it's still very patronage driven, and the people in power need incentive to let go of power. What will you be telling the cabinet secretaries you will be meeting with for a long time this week?
Well, no, my impression is that, that the current government in the Philippines is very, it seems to me that the president sees himself very much following in the footsteps of his father and mother. His father, by the way, was a fellow at the Weatherhead Center, where I was the director at Harvard. So there's a strong Harvard connection to the presidential regime in the Philippines. They were the people who helped orchestrate this people's power, the ousting of the Marcos dictatorship, and so my impression is that he sees himself very much in that tradition of and trying to deliver on the promises that got derailed after the people's power after 1986.
What steps? What steps would you recommend?
Well, I think he's trying to take steps. He's trying to expand education to try to expand access to healthcare. Why is education important? Well, you could say education is important because it gives people more skills, they get better jobs, they leave the Philippines because their opportunities are so blocked here. That's a wonderful example. A piece of evidence about how extractive institutions are in the Philippines. It seems to me this extraordinary exodus from the country.
Correct.
But why is education important? Education is important for these reasons, for getting people better jobs, higher wages, whatever. Education opens your mind, whatever. But education is also important for trying to help change the politics in society. For trying to help people understand their grievances and the problems in society, for helping them to kind of cooperate and coordinate, and for making them less dependent on patronage or favors, or to understand their rights and and not so rights, not favors. And so I would say you could think of this educational expansion as something which if I was a politician would be, I would hope that this would also would change the politics in an enduring way, because at the end of the day most Filipinos suffer from this system. This is not a system that benefits the majority of people in this society. So it's just a matter of the majority of people collectively understanding their predicament. If you can achieve that, then you will have change. This is a society where there may be many dysfunctional aspects to democracy, but democracy works well enough to elect President Aquino. So this is not Laos or Uzbekistan or Gabon. Yeah. So that's a very hopeful thing. It's just that the job was only half done in 1986. So now you have to go the whole way.
Fantastic. You're actually coming at an optimistic time for us. Third quarter growth rate was announced at 7.1% GDP, which is the second largest, second fastest in Asia. James Robinson, thank you so much for speaking with us. We've been speaking with Dr. James Robinson, the Harvard University professor. He is a co-author of Why Nations Fail. Send us your questions, tweet your comments, Rappler.com on Twitter, and Rappler on Facebook. I'm Maria Ressa. Thank you for joining us.